So the Sega Genesis Mini is not even upon us yet. We still got like 5 months to go, but the hype is pretty big. I'm super hyped for this thing. The 20 games they've announced so far have me excited for sure. I can't wait to hear what else is going to be released on it. But it got me thinking, what about the Sega CD? Are we going to get Sega CD games? And unfortunately, no, we're not getting Sega CD games on the Genesis Mini. But then I'm thinking like, but what about a Sega CD Mini? It only makes sense, right? The Genesis Mini has that little port that you pop off and it's just there for show, just to look neat. But wouldn't it make sense if that was there for a purpose, to have some kind of uniformity between another device, to be able to have the aesthetics of a complete system? What if they released the Sega CD Mini and it attached to the Genesis Mini by removing that expansion port, popping it on there, and boom, you have an add-on? It would only make sense. And this thing this interview here with Sega Chief Contents Officer Hiroyuki Miyazaki, I probably said his name wrong. I apologize. No, I don't. But he had an interview with Famitsu, and there was some talk about the Sega CD Mini, and this kind of flew under the radar for me. That's what I want to talk about today. What is the possibility of a Sega CD Mini coming? What about a Sega Saturn Mini? What about a 32X Mini, right? So, yes, the hype is real. And I'm really thinking on the Sega CD Mini, is it a possibility? And I think it is it's going to happen. It only makes sense that it's going to happen, but is it going to happen in the States? Because when you really think about it, before we get into this interview, the States had less than a couple hundred games for the Sega CD. And we're going to take a look at the games in a moment. But like a lot of these, consoles that were produced in Japan back in the day, they wound up getting a hell of a lot more games than we did. So what's the likelihood of us getting it? We'll take a look at the games, kind of speculate on that in a second, but let's take a look at this interview. So this Siliconera, Silicon Era. Jeez, man. They have the translated responses, some quotes from the interview. There's some interesting stuff, not just on the Mega Drive, Sega Genesis Mini, a few other things, but like this one, for example, I thought was kind of funny because it was my thoughts exactly when I saw this. When we asked fans to vote between titles, which was on the Japanese Sega Twitter account and on their website, they had like a poll where they were asking like, hey, pick this game between this game. Which would you like to see on the Mega Drive Mini? And people were getting pissed. Like, I don't want to vote between Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. I want them both, or whatever games they put up. It was like, I can't pick between my favorites. I just want them all. So he's saying people yelled at us saying, just put them all in. I thought we'd get praise for that. But yeah. And it's cool that they like to interact with the community. That's a great thing. But yeah, it kind of backfired. People, don't take those kind of things the way the intent is. And I think it's just to connect with people. It's not necessarily to make a decision, just to gauge interest and that kind of stuff. And people didn't look at it that way. They just looked at it like, no, I don't want to vote. I don't want to be the vote that decides that this game doesn't get on there, that kind of thing. But that was pretty funny. So scrolling down, we got to find the spot where they're talking about the Sega CD. And here we go. Mega CD or Sega CD in the States. Titles will not be in the mix. So that's confirmation. It's only Sega Genesis games, Sega Mega Drive games on this Mini right now. But he goes on to state, we might do a Sega CD Mini if the Mega Drive Mini sells a whole bunch. Then just maybe. Only makes damn sense that they would. They already have the system set up to just attach it to one, right? I think they kind of had that in mind. Let's be honest, because if you sold a Sega CD Mini and there was nothing attached to it, people, they're going to want that aesthetic. So it's going to cost them, if they don't already have the Sega Genesis Mini, they're going to want to buy one. If they had more, like they had some extreme interest in the Sega CD Mini, they want that to have that aesthetic. They want that have that whole system. So that makes sense. Or if they just release the Sega CD Mini with like just a fake shell attached to it, which they could do because these guys like to do options, obviously in Japan anyway. They could do that as well. Sell a dummy Mini that attaches to the top, or just have one that comes whole. I mean, where you pay extra and you get both devices in there. There's so many possibilities with this. You don't want to make too many SKUs. You know what I mean? Some companies just overdo it with too many options for the same damn thing. But I could really see this happening. It seems like they had this in mind. And then going forward, this is one I've heard a lot of people ask about, even in my comment section, stating that they really want this. And this has always been my response too. Not in these exact words, but his response pretty much mirrors the way I've been talking about this. As for a Sega Saturn Mini, the balance of cost and technology is still far from certain. It makes sense because emulation's not spot on for Sega Saturn. The technology to, like, if they made a Sega Saturn Mini and it cost a couple $100 and it had a handful of games, who's going to buy that other than the most hardcore fan? That's not going to have a mass market appeal where they're, if they could release something at $80 versus $200, they'll get more sales and make more money off of the cheaper price because there's going to be more interest. There's going to be more people who could afford it. $200 for an emulation device that plays a handful of games, it's not going to do that well, in my opinion. I mean, I could be wrong, but I wouldn't buy it. I mean, maybe I would, but I wouldn't buy it. So it makes sense. The technology right now, the cost behind that, it's not there to be able to introduce a product like that for the Sega Saturn. That's unfortunate. People could be like, well, they made a PlayStation Mini. Why couldn't they make a Sega Saturn Mini? Well, if they made a Sega Saturn Mini, it would be a disaster right now if they could keep it at a budget price, I think, anyway. PlayStation, the architecture, the emulation, it's been there for a long while. Sega Saturn, it has not. So due to the architecture, the way that system worked, it's taken a while to crack that thing and to get emulation to a point where it makes sense. Like, I don't even emulate Sega Saturn. I just don't. I don't bother with that. But at some point it will happen, I think, but just not for some years. So the last thing that they have a quote on, the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis Mini isn't something that can easily be produced. So please be sure to pre-order. I think they're producing a ton of these. Pre-orders haven't sold out from what I have seen. Maybe in Japan they have with like the deluxe one. And certain websites I heard were having ones with the little fake cartridge that goes in the top, because that cartridge slot, bloop, 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 you can put something in there. And I'm sure people are going to be 3D printing carts for this thing. But that leads me to believe too, like, what about the Sega 32X Mini? Is that a possibility? Pop that thing, bloop, and then play a handful of Sega 32X games. I mean, the Mega SG can't. The Poly Mega can, right? What about the Sega Genesis Mini? What? Mind blown. Boom. Not really. I mean, there's a couple there's a handful of games that are all right on the 32X. I don't really care for too many of them, but there's some that I like. That would be kind of cool. But that leads me back to what I was talking about earlier with the Sega CD. These right here, the box arts for all the games released in the US. And I've been scrolling through this thing quite a bit today, thinking like, if they release this in the States, what games would we get? I have 171 box arts in here, and I don't think they're all US. I think there's a couple that are European and then multi-disc stuff as well. So there's under 170 games in the US. Just looking at this, as far as licensing goes, I'm not seeing a whole lot. Afterburner, maybe. I mean, there's some good games, but what would we get on this thing? Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, that's a good possibility because Capcom, they want to make those bucks. And then the same thing with like Final Fight. Earthworm Jim, why not? I mean, kind of double dipping, but why not? Echo the Dolphin, we would see for sure. I don't see why not. That would be on there. Dungeon Explorer, maybe. I mean, would we get like the Dragon's Lair, the Time Gal, those games? Space Ace, was Space Ace released on here? I think it was. Yeah, Space Ace was released on there. Snatcher, maybe. We wouldn't get the Smurfs. We wouldn't get Scottie Pippen Slam City. That wouldn't happen. But just looking at these games, I'm kind of on the fence on if this did happen, if it would happen in the States, because just there's too many games that I'm not sure that they would be able to get the license to. We would get Sonic CD. That makes sense. Maybe the Lunar games, maybe Popful Mail. I mean, we're getting too heavy on role-playing games. Shining Force, it's getting a little too heavy. Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors. I have never heard of that game, ever. I love Penn Jillette, but I never knew they had a video game. What the frick is? I'm going to have to look that one up. I'm going to have to check that out. Power Factory featuring CNC Music Factory. Like, I don't, there's so much. Make My Video, the NXS, Crisscross, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Like, Crisscross, screw you guys. I had a freaking copyright claim for playing that game on stream before. Then, I mean, there's great games here. Look at these light gun games. Lethal Enforcers, they had 1 and 2. Mad Dog McCree 2. Those are awesome games, but not going to happen. Not going to happen. KO the Flying Squadron, that's a possibility, but I mean, Final Fight, yes. What about the SNK games? Fatal Fury and I think Samurai Showdown was released on this as well. Would that happen? Probably not, because SNK's doing their own thing. Do they want that money? Maybe. Road Rash? I mean, I'm seeing like 5 to 10 games that I think would for sure be on there. These Sega classics, these collections, I don't see that happening. Reason being is because they're just Genesis games. They're not even arcade games. And I have those, so to me, it doesn't make sense. Like, they wouldn't put that on there. What games would we get? That's what makes me think, like, if this happened, it would for sure happen in Japan. It's a big if for the States, because what would they put on there? I mean, what? Night Trap? I mean, maybe, right? But there you go. Share your thoughts. Let me know what you think. I just thought this was an interesting thing to talk about. I have a couple videos that I'm working on today. I have another one that will be uploaded later concerning the McWill Game Boy Color mod. So stay tuned for that. Really do appreciate you guys hanging out with me. You mean the world to me. You really do. Thumbs that up or thumbs it down. If you made it this far, you might have already made up your mind, and it is what it is. But you know what? If you thumbs down, hope you stub your toe, mofo. Peace out, bye-bye, and boom. Bye.